This table is mine now. Until the single dad mechanic made the billionaire woman speechless, Maven's Corner Cafe breathes with Friday evening warmth. Coffee steam curls upward, rain drums against weathered windows. The scent of cinnamon apple pie mingles with autumn's chill seeping through the door. Ryan Torres steps inside, motor oil embedded beneath his fingernails, flannel shirt wrinkled from crawling under car hoods all day. Jamie's small fingers wrap around his father's weathered hand like a lifeline. Their corner table waits. The same scarred wooden surface where Michelle once spread her students' papers, red pen dancing across homework assignments. But tonight, their sanctuary is occupied. A stranger sits there, designer blazer crisp as fresh paper, laptop glowing, blueprints fanned across the table like claimed territory. "Excuse me," Ryan's voice cuts through the cafe's gentle hum. "That's our table." She lifts her gaze slowly, eyes like winter glass behind expensive frames. Her lips curve into something sharp and cold. "Not anymore. This table is mine now." But when this billionaire developer discovers the ghost who still sits at that table, and the man who would do anything to protect her memory, her words will catch in her throat, and silence will be all she has left. 2 years had carved deep lines around Ryan's eyes. 2 years since Michelle's last whispered, "I love you," in the hospital room that smelled of disinfectant and dying flowers. 2 years since he learned that grief doesn't follow schedules or respect work obligations. The medical bills had nearly buried Torres Automotive, along with his wife. Insurance covering treatments, but not the months of missed work or experimental therapies that promised miracles and delivered bankruptcy instead. Now Ryan worked 16-hour days just to keep the lights on at his garage. Brake jobs before dawn, transmission rebuilds that stretched past midnight under harsh fluorescent bulbs. His calloused hands moved with mechanical precision while his mind wandered to memories of Michelle's laughter echoing through their kitchen on Sunday mornings. She'd made pancakes in the shape of animals, convinced that dinosaur pancakes tasted better than regular ones. Jamie spent those long afternoons with Mrs. Henderson next door, a widow who understood loss and never complained when Ryan arrived at 9 in the evening with exhaustion carved into his face. She'd feed Jamie dinner, help with homework, and pretend not to notice when Ryan's voice cracked while reading bedtime stories about families that stayed together forever. Some fairy tales, they both knew, were cruel lies disguised as comfort. But every Friday evening belonged to them alone. Father and son at Maven's Corner, sharing the corner table where Michelle used to grade math tests with a red pen that moved like a conductor's baton. She'd sip coffee and watch Jamie color elaborate pictures of their family. Always 3 stick figures holding hands under a crayon sun, sometimes with a golden retriever named Buddy that they'd never had money to buy. The ritual kept her memory alive in ways that photo albums couldn't touch. Frank Kowalski had built Maven's Corner from nothing 40 years ago. His weathered hands had installed every light fixture, painted every wall the warm yellow that made customers feel welcome even on the greyest days. He'd served coffee to 3 generations of Cedar Falls families, witnessed proposals that became golden anniversaries, hosted birthday parties for children who grew up to bring their own kids for hot chocolate, when snow covered the windows like frosting. Frank knew everyone's usual order without asking. He knew who was going through divorce, who'd lost jobs, who needed an extra cookie slipped onto their plate when they thought nobody was looking. Maven's Corner wasn't just a cafe. It was the heart of a community that beat steadily, despite economic downturns and corporate chains that promised convenience, but delivered nothing resembling soul. Some traditions mattered more than profit margins or efficiency reports. Tonight, Victoria Reed occupied their sacred space like an invading army disguised as a businesswoman. Her laptop screen cast cold blue light across features that seemed carved from expensive marble. Sharp cheekbones, perfectly straight nose, lips that had forgotten how to smile without calculating the cost. The blueprints spread before her showed aerial views of downtown Cedar Falls with surgical precision, red lines marking buildings for demolition like a general's battle plan. Victoria had done her homework with corporate thoroughness. Every property value, every business lease, every family that would need to disappear for progress to march forward unopposed. Numbers filled the margins in her precise handwriting. Purchase prices, construction estimates, projected returns on investment. She'd reduced an entire community to mathematical equations that would be solved by bulldozers and bank transfers. Ryan's jaw clenched as he processed the scene unfolding before him. This woman had claimed their table like she owned it, turned their sanctuary into a boardroom where human attachments were just obstacles to overcome with sufficient leverage. Jamie pressed closer to his father's side, 8-year-old instincts picking up on tension that crackled through the air like electricity before a thunderstorm. "That's our table," Ryan repeated, his voice carrying 2 years of Friday evenings, of memories soaked into that particular piece of furniture, like coffee stains that refused to wash clean. The words hung between them like a gauntlet thrown down, a line drawn that neither seemed willing to cross first. Other customers paused their conversations, sensing drama unfolding in their familiar sanctuary. Victoria's smile never wavered, professional, practiced, designed to end uncomfortable conversations before they could gather momentum. "I'm conducting important business here," she said, her tone suggesting that reasonable people would accept this reality and find other seats without making scenes. "Surely you can accommodate a paying customer." The words carried subtle condescension, implying that men who smelled like motor oil shouldn't challenge women who carried themselves like they owned the world. Frank emerged from behind the counter with flour still dusting his apron from the evening's fresh pie batch. 73 years old and still quick enough to referee disputes when his customers needed diplomatic intervention. His eyes moved between Ryan and the stranger, calculating the situation with wisdom earned through decades of managing small-town social dynamics where everyone knew everyone else's business. "Evening, Ryan. Jamie, everything all right over here?" "Just explaining to this lady that she's sitting in our regular spot," Ryan said, keeping his voice level despite the frustration building in his chest. Jamie's grip on his father's hand tightened, the boy understanding that something important was happening, even if the adult complexities remained beyond his comprehension. The corner table meant something sacred to their family, something that couldn't be negotiated away or replaced with good intentions. Victoria glanced up at Frank with barely concealed irritation, clearly unaccustomed to having her authority questioned by small-town business owners. "I arrived first," she stated with corporate precision. "I'm working on important projects that affect this entire community. This is a public establishment, correct?" Each word carried the implied threat of someone who'd learned to get her way through sheer force of professional will and carefully applied pressure. The cafe fell silent except for the gentle hiss of the espresso machine and rain drumming steadily against windows that had watched over Cedar Falls for 4 decades. Other customers pretended to focus on their coffee while straining to hear every word of the confrontation unfolding at the corner table. Frank's weathered hands worked his dish rag in slow, thoughtful circles, the same motion he'd used to think through complicated problems since before Ryan was born. "Mom," Frank said finally, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who'd built something lasting in a world that seemed determined to tear down everything familiar. "That particular table has been reserved every Friday evening for the past 2 years. Same time, same people. It's not written down anywhere, but some agreements run deeper than contracts." He spoke with the gentle firmness of someone who understood that traditions held communities together when everything else fell apart. Victoria's professional mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something harder and more calculating underneath. She clearly hadn't expected resistance from locals who should have been impressed by her expensive clothes and corporate confidence. Small towns were supposed to be grateful for outside investment, eager to sell their souls for the promise of economic development. Reserved by whom exactly? I don't see any posted policies or official documentation. Reserved by people who matter to this place, Frank replied, his tone remaining gentle, but absolutely immovable. Ryan here keeps half the cars in town running when folks can't afford dealership prices. Jamie's mama used to teach most of our children before the cancer took her. That table holds memories that can't be bought, sold, or relocated for anyone's convenience. The words hung in the air like incense, sanctifying space that Victoria had unknowingly violated. Something flickered behind Victoria's winter glass eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or the first crack in her professional armor. She looked at Jamie with fresh attention, taking in his serious brown eyes and the way he stayed pressed against his father's protective presence. 8 years old, and already acquainted with loss in ways that would have broken some adults completely. I didn't realize, she said, her voice softer now, the admission seeming to cost her something valuable. Ryan felt the moment shifting like ice breaking up on a river in spring. Perhaps this could be resolved without further conflict, without turning their Friday tradition into a battlefield where his son would learn ugly lessons about power and privilege. It's fine, he heard himself saying, surprising his own willingness to extend understanding to a stranger who'd invaded their sanctuary. We can find another table tonight. No harm done. No, Victoria said suddenly, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. She snapped her laptop closed with military precision, gathered her blueprints with movements that betrayed barely controlled emotion. No, you're absolutely right. This is your table, your tradition, your space. Her hands trembled slightly as she organized her papers, whatever composure she'd maintained beginning to crack around the edges like old paint in winter weather. Jamie's voice cut through the adult tension with the pure, unfiltered honesty that only children could manage. Are you okay, lady? You look really sad. The observation hit the room like a bell tolling, resonating with truth that made everyone pause mid-breath. Children saw things that adults trained themselves to ignore or explain away with comfortable lies about professional necessity and business obligations. Victoria froze with one arm halfway through her coat sleeve, Jamie's innocent question penetrating defenses she'd spent years constructing. She turned to face the boy directly, and for one heartbeat her carefully maintained facade crumbled entirely. Raw pain flickered across her features before she could rebuild the walls that kept the world at arm's length. I'm fine, sweetheart, she managed, but her voice broke on the words like thin ice under pressure. Frank cleared his throat with diplomatic precision, decades of experience teaching him when to intervene in situations that threatened to spiral beyond anyone's control. Table's big enough for sharing, if everyone's agreeable to that arrangement, he suggested, his tone carefully neutral. I could bring over some extra chairs, maybe some of that apple pie that's been calling people's names all evening. The offer landed in neutral territory between conflict and resolution, giving both parties a graceful way forward. Ryan found himself nodding before his rational mind could raise objections. Something about Victoria's momentary vulnerability had shifted his entire perspective on the situation. She wasn't just a corporate invader claiming their table. She was someone carrying her own invisible burdens, fighting battles that didn't show in quarterly reports or professional achievements. That works for us, he said, then looked down at Jamie. What do you think, buddy? Should we share our table with the sad lady? Jamie's face lit up with the kind of pure joy that children brought to simple human connections, the enthusiasm that made adults remember what they'd lost in the process of becoming responsible and careful. Yes, we can show her how good Frank's cookies are, and maybe she wants to see my homework. His excitement was infectious, breaking the last remaining ice between adults who'd been circling each other like suspicious animals just moments before. Victoria hesitated, professional instincts warring with something deeper and more human than anything she'd felt in years of corporate warfare. Sharing a table meant conversation, and conversation meant connection. And connection was dangerous territory for someone whose career required emotional distance from the communities she was paid to analyze, evaluate, and ultimately recommend for destruction. But Jamie's open smile and Ryan's gentle eyes made retreat feel like cowardice rather than strategic wisdom. "I suppose that would be acceptable," she said, attempting to regain some professional dignity, even as she allowed herself to be drawn back into the warmth of genuine human contact for the first time in longer than she cared to calculate. She settled back into the chair she'd just vacated, but this time her posture was less territorial, more tentative, like a wild animal learning to trust outstretched hands offering food instead of pain. "I'm Victoria Reed," she said, extending a hand that bore traces of expensive manicures, but also small calluses that suggested someone who occasionally worked with tools instead of just spreadsheets and PowerPoint presentations. Her grip was firm, but not aggressive, professional, but warming toward something more personal as the seconds passed. "Thank you for sharing your special place with a stranger. Ryan Torres," he replied, his handshake lasting a moment longer than pure politeness required. Both of them seemed surprised by the genuine warmth that passed between work-hardened palms, the recognition of shared humanity beneath their different circumstances. "And this tornado of energy is Jamie. Fair warning, he asks about 1,000,000 questions once he gets comfortable with new people." The pride in his voice was unmistakable, the love of a father who'd learned to be both mother and protector to his child. Frank appeared with additional chairs and his knowing smile, the expression of a man who'd orchestrated this exact outcome from the moment tensions began rising around his corner table. "Coffee all around?" he asked, already knowing the answers from years of serving the same customers their preferred comfort. "And Jamie, I believe there's a fresh batch of chocolate chip cookies that desperately need quality testing from an expert." His easy manner helped settle lingering awkwardness, transforming potential conflict into an impromptu dinner party. As they arranged themselves around the shared table, Victoria found herself studying the father and son with curiosity that gradually softened from professional assessment into something resembling genuine interest. Ryan moved with the careful efficiency of someone who'd learned to handle every aspect of childcare single-handedly, anticipating Jamie's needs while maintaining the gentle authority that kept an energetic 8-year-old focused on homework instead of 20 different distractions. Jamie chatted easily about his day at Cedar Falls Elementary, his artwork that covered their refrigerator at home, his plans for the upcoming weekend that involved building a fort in their backyard if the weather cooperated. Normal family conversation, Victoria realized with something approaching wonder. This was what regular people talked about when they weren't performing for business meetings or calculating their next career moves. The revelation felt like discovering a new species of human interaction. "So what brings you to Cedar Falls?" Ryan asked, attempting the kind of polite conversation that strangers made while sharing space and getting acquainted. It was an innocent question, the sort of thing anyone might ask a visitor to their small town. But Victoria's slight hesitation before answering suggested that even simple inquiries carried complications she wasn't prepared to navigate with complete honesty. "Business research," she replied carefully, then seemed to realize how evasive that sounded to people who valued straight talk over corporate speak. "Market analysis, really, studying local economic patterns and development opportunities." Each word was chosen with precision, edited to remove any details that might reveal her true purpose. She couldn't very well explain that she'd been sent to assess how much resistance the community might offer to having their downtown demolished and replaced with a shopping complex designed by focus groups in Chicago. Jamie looked up from the coloring book that Frank had produced from behind the counter, like a magician pulling rabbits from hats. "What kind of opportunities?" he asked, with the direct curiosity that made adults squirm when they were trying to avoid uncomfortable truths. "Are you going to help Cedar Falls get better stores? We really need a good toy store, and maybe a place that sells those pretzels like they have at the mall." Victoria's chest tightened with unexpected guilt as she looked into Jamie's hopeful brown eyes. This child had no idea that her recommendations might eliminate not just the toy store he dreamed of, but the entire downtown where his family created memories every Friday evening. "Not exactly those kinds of improvements, sweetheart," she managed, forcing a smile that felt like wearing someone else's ill-fitting clothes. "More like helping existing businesses find new locations when changes happen." Ryan nodded thoughtfully, apparently accepting her explanation at face value, with the trust that small-town people extended to strangers until given reason to do otherwise. "That sounds like important work," he said with genuine respect. "Small communities like this one need all the help they can get, staying competitive with bigger cities and chain stores. It's hard for local businesses to survive when everything's changing so fast." His words stung more than suspicion would have, trust being infinitely more painful than hostility when you were betraying it with every breath. The conversation drifted toward safer territory as Frank delivered coffee and generous slices of apple pie that filled the air with cinnamon warmth. They talked about the unusually wet autumn weather, Jamie's progress in 3rd grade, Frank's famous recipes that had been handed down through 3 generations of his family. Victoria found herself relaxing despite every professional instinct screaming warnings about emotional involvement with target populations. These people were genuinely nice, she realized with something approaching shock. Nice without ulterior motives or hidden agendas. They shared their table, their evening, their family tradition without expecting anything in return except basic human courtesy. When had she last encountered such generosity? When had anyone invited her into their personal space simply because she looked like she needed connection rather than because she could provide something they wanted? Jamie finished his math homework with his father's patient assistance, showing his work with the pride of a child who was learning that effort mattered more than perfection. Then he pulled out a fresh box of crayons and clean paper, announcing his artistic intentions with the serious concentration of someone embarking on important creative work. "I'm going to draw our table tonight," he declared, "with all of us sitting together like a real family dinner." Victoria watched the boy's artistic process with fascination that gradually deepened into something resembling wonder. When had she last seen a child create something purely for the joy of creation? When had she been around children at all, for that matter? Her world consisted of airports and hotel suites, conference rooms and rental cars, places where real families existed only in demographic reports and market research statistics. "That's beautiful work," she said when Jamie held up his finished masterpiece, 4 stick figures sitting around a brown rectangle that was clearly meant to represent their shared table. "But who's that 4th person?" she asked, pointing to a figure with longer hair and what appeared to be a dress, positioned between Ryan and Jamie with protective arms reaching toward both of them. "That's my mama," Jamie explained, with the matter-of-fact acceptance that children brought to mysteries adults spent lifetimes trying to understand. "She always sits with us on Fridays, even though we can't see her anymore. Daddy says she watches over us from heaven, making sure we're okay and remembering to eat vegetables and brush our teeth." His casual mention of death and continuing presence made Victoria's throat tighten with emotions she couldn't identify or control. Ryan's hand briefly touched his son's shoulder in a gesture of love and protection that Victoria felt like a physical ache in her chest. How long had it been since anyone had touched her with such unconscious affection? How long since she'd witnessed the kind of love that survived death and transformed grief into gratitude for time shared rather than bitterness over time lost? "Mama would like you," Jamie continued, completely unaware of the emotional earthquake his words were creating in the woman across the table. "She liked meeting new people and making them feel welcome. Daddy says she could make friends with anyone, even grumpy people who forgot how to smile." The innocent observation hit Victoria like a physical blow, forcing her to confront the reality that she'd become exactly the kind of person who'd forgotten fundamental human skills. "She sounds like a wonderful person," Victoria managed, surprised by how much she meant those words. She'd trained herself to see people as variables in equations, obstacles to overcome, or assets to leverage for maximum advantage. But sitting at this table, listening to a child talk about his mother's love reaching beyond death to protect her family, she remembered what it felt like to think of humans as simply beautifully human. Frank approached with dessert plates and the kind of generous hospitality that had made Maven's Corner the heart of Cedar Falls for 4 decades. "Apple pie's on the house tonight," he announced when Ryan started to protest the additional expense. "Friday evening special for good customers and new friends who know how to share." The pie was still warm from the oven, filling their corner of the cafe with scents that spoke of home and comfort, and traditions that connected generations. As they ate, Jamie peppered Victoria with questions that revealed both his endless curiosity and the innocence that hadn't yet learned which topics adults considered off-limits. Where did she live? What kind of car did she drive? Did she have any pets? What was her favorite color? Victoria found herself answering with honesty that surprised her, sharing details about her life that she rarely spoke aloud even to herself. She lived in Chicago, in a downtown apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over Lake Michigan, but had never displayed a single personal photograph. She drove whatever rental car the company provided, never staying anywhere long enough to justify owning something permanent. She traveled too much for pets, though she sometimes fed stray cats in hotel parking lots when she thought nobody was watching. Her favorite color was blue, like the lake on sunny mornings when she was young and still believed in possibilities. "Why don't you have any pictures in your house?" Jamie asked with 8-year-old logic that cut straight to questions adults learned not to voice. "Pictures make places feel like home. We have lots of pictures of Mama everywhere, on the refrigerator, by my bed, even in Daddy's toolbox at work. He says it helps us remember all the happy times instead of just the sad ending." Victoria's fork paused halfway to her mouth, Jamie's innocent question forcing her to confront truths she'd been avoiding for years. How could she explain to a child that pictures implied permanence, relationships, connections that might become liabilities in a career built on professional distance and emotional detachment? That she'd learned not to get attached to places or people because both eventually disappeared, leaving nothing but empty spaces and expensive therapy bills? "I move around too much for pictures," she said finally, the explanation sounding hollow even to her own ears. "They'd just get damaged in all the packing and unpacking." But as she spoke, Victoria's gaze fell on Jamie's drawing lying beside her plate. 4 stick figures around a table, including one who existed now only in love and memory. Even children understood that some things were worth protecting, worth carrying carefully from place to place, no matter how inconvenient they might prove. Ryan sensed the shift in Victoria's mood, with the sensitivity of someone who'd learned to read emotional weather patterns in his son's face. He smoothly redirected the conversation toward lighter territory, telling stories about unusual repairs at his garage, the eccentric customers who'd become like family over the years, the satisfaction that came from fixing things that seemed beyond repair. His voice carried contentment that Victoria envied, the peace of a man who built things instead of tearing them down. As the evening progressed, Victoria found herself genuinely laughing at Ryan's gentle humor and Jamie's innocent observations about the world around him. When had she last laughed without calculating how her reaction might be interpreted or leveraged for professional advantage? The sound of her own unguarded amusement surprised her, rusty from disuse but surprisingly warm and authentic. Other customers came and went through Maven's Corner's welcoming doors, nodding politely to their table as if the four of them, 5, counting Michelle's invisible but undeniable presence, belonged together as naturally as any family. Frank refilled coffee cups and cleared plates with unobtrusive efficiency, understanding that some conversations were too important to interrupt with unnecessary business. Eventually, Jamie's yawns became too frequent to ignore, and Ryan began the familiar ritual of gathering their belongings for the journey home. "Past someone's bedtime," he said with fond exasperation, tempered by love. "School comes early tomorrow morning, buddy." Jamie protested with the universal whine of children who never wanted magical evenings to end, but his resistance was half-hearted at best. The night had been special, and he seemed to understand instinctively that trying to extend it artificially would only diminish its natural magic. Victoria felt an unexpected pang of loss as they prepared to leave, the evening having passed without her noticing time's passage, a rare experience in her carefully scheduled, productivity-obsessed professional life. "Thank you," she said, the simple words carrying more weight than casual politeness usually bore, "for sharing your table, your tradition, your Friday evening with a complete stranger. I haven't had a real family dinner in longer than I care to admit." Ryan paused in the process of helping Jamie into his rain jacket, something in Victoria's voice suggesting depths of loneliness that her professional facade usually kept hidden from public view. The admission hung in the air between them like a bridge that might lead somewhere meaningful if either of them was brave enough to cross it. "You're welcome to join us again next week," he said impulsively, the invitation surprising him even as he spoke it. "Same time, same table. If you're still in Cedar Falls, that is." Jamie's face illuminated with pure joy at his father's unexpected invitation. "Yes, you can meet more people and maybe Frank will let us try the cherry pie next time, and I can show you my collection of cool rocks that I found by the river." His enthusiasm was infectious, making both adults smile despite their complicated adult reservations about friendship and professional boundaries and the 100 reasons why getting attached was usually a mistake. Victoria opened her mouth to politely decline. She'd be gone by next Friday, her assessment completed, her recommendations filed, Cedar Falls' fate sealed in corporate boardrooms hundreds of miles away from the human consequences of economic development. But looking at Jamie's hopeful brown eyes and Ryan's genuine warmth, she found herself nodding instead of retreating behind professional excuses. "I'd like that very much," she heard herself saying. "I'd really like that." They parted ways in the gravel parking lot behind Maven's Corner, rain still falling in gentle sheets that caught streetlight like scattered diamonds and made the whole world seem softer around the edges. Victoria sat in her rental car for several minutes after Ryan's truck disappeared around the corner, trying to process what had just happened to her carefully controlled professional equilibrium. She'd come to Cedar Falls to conduct a cold assessment of community vulnerability to corporate displacement, to identify pressure points and resistance factors that would help her employers maximize profit while minimizing public relations complications. Instead, she'd found herself welcomed into the kind of genuine human connection she'd spent years avoiding as professionally dangerous and emotionally inconvenient. The blueprints lay forgotten on her passenger seat, red lines marking properties for demolition suddenly looking less like progress and more like violence against communities that had taken generations to build. How had she never noticed before that those neat geometric shapes represented real people's lives, their memories, their Friday evening traditions that held families together across terrible spaces left by death and corporate indifference. Victoria drove back to her sterile hotel room that night with more questions than answers, and for the first time in her successful but empty career, she wasn't entirely certain she wanted to find solutions that fit neatly into quarterly reports and PowerPoint presentations. Some problems, she was beginning to suspect, became infinitely more complicated the more clearly you learned to see the human faces behind the statistics and demographic projections. And some tables, once shared with genuine love and authentic welcome, could never again be claimed as exclusively your own, no matter what the corporate contracts and development agreements might say about property rights and economic necessity. The heart, Victoria was discovering, followed different laws entirely, laws that had nothing to do with profit margins and everything to do with the kind of belonging that transformed strangers into family one Friday evening at a time.